Michael Carter, a respected federal judge, had spent years fighting for justice in the courtroom. But now he was looking forward to something much simpler, a fresh start. He had just moved into an upscale suburban neighborhood with his 17-year-old blind son, Ethan, hoping to provide him with a peaceful environment. For Ethan, life had never been easy. Losing his sight at a young age meant he had to rely on his trusted guide dog, Shadow, a highly trained Labrador who had been his constant companion for years. Shadow wasn't just a pet, he was Ethan's lifeline. He helped Ethan navigate sidewalks, detect obstacles, and even sense when he was feeling anxious. The two were inseparable. The neighborhood seemed idyllic at first. The houses were well kept, the lawns perfectly manicured, and the streets quiet and clean. It appeared to be the perfect place for a fresh start, or so they thought. Shortly after settling in, Michael received a welcome packet from the local homeowners association, HOA. It contained pages upon pages of strict community rules that covered everything from how high fences could be to what color flowers were allowed in front yards. At the very bottom of the rulebook, he noticed a section titled Pet Regulations. Michael read through it carefully. It outlined strict pet restrictions, stating that all animals had to be approved and registered by the HOA. But something caught his eye. There was no mention of service animals being exempt. "That's strange," he muttered, setting the papers down. He had dealt with HOA cases before, and federal law always superseded HOA rules, especially when it came to service animals and disability rights. Still, he didn't think much of it. Surely they wouldn't enforce these rules against a service dog. Or so he thought. It wouldn't be long before the HOA made their first move, and it would set off a chain of events that no one in the community would ever forget. Just a week after moving in, Michael received his first HOA violation notice in the mail. The envelope was thick, and when he pulled out the letter, the bolded words at the top immediately caught his attention. Immediate compliance required, unauthorized animal on premises. Michael frowned as he read the letter. It stated that Shadow was in violation of the HOA's No Pets Without Approval rule, and that Michael had 72 hours to remove the dog from the property, or he would start incurring daily fines. The letter also threatened legal action and potential eviction if the problem wasn't resolved. "This has to be a mistake," Michael muttered, setting the letter down. Service animals were protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, and no HOA had the power to override federal law. But just as he was about to call the HOA office, a knock on the door interrupted him. He opened it to find two HOA board members standing stiffly on his porch, both dressed in matching polo shirts with the HOA logo embroidered on them. One of them, a woman with sharp features and an overly bright smile, introduced herself. "Mr. Carter," she said sweetly. "I'm Linda Powell, the HOA president. We noticed you haven't submitted an approval request for your pet, and we're here to discuss the matter." Michael crossed his arms. "Shadow isn't just a pet. He's a service animal for my son, Ethan. That means he's legally allowed to be here, regardless of your HOA rules." Linda's smile faltered for a moment before she quickly recovered. "Oh, we understand," she said in a syrupy voice. "But rules are rules, and we require all residents to submit formal paperwork for any animal. It's standard procedure." Michael narrowed his eyes. "Even for service animals?" Linda's expression turned smug. "Yes, and unfortunately, our HOA doesn't allow large dogs in the neighborhood, even if they're service animals. You'll need to find another way to accommodate your son's needs." Michael's blood boiled. "Are you seriously suggesting my blind son live without his guide dog?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Linda simply shrugged. "We make exceptions for smaller service animals, like a trained cat or maybe a miniature horse. But that dog," she pointed at Shadow, who sat obediently at Michael's feet, "is too big for this community." Michael clenched his jaw. He had encountered power-hungry HOA board members before, but this was a new level of ignorance. "Let me be very clear," he said, his voice low but firm. "Federal law overrides any HOA policy you have. Shadow is legally allowed to stay." Linda's fake smile vanished. "We'll see about that." With that, she spun on her heel and stormed off, her fellow board member trailing behind her. Michael watched them leave, his jaw tightening. He could already tell this wasn't the end of it. The HOA had just declared war, and they had no idea who they were messing with. The next morning, Michael woke up to a bright orange notice taped to his front door. He ripped it off and read it. "Final warning, $250 fine issued for violation of HOA pet policy." Daily fines will continue until animal is removed. Michael's hands tightened around a paper. They had escalated from a warning to an actual fine overnight. He stormed over to his laptop and checked his HOA online account. Sure enough, a new charge had been added, $250, with another $50 set to be added every single day until Shadow was gone. This is insanity, he muttered. Michael called the HOA office, but the line rang straight to voicemail. He then sent an email, laying out the federal protections for service animals and warning them they were violating the ADA. An hour later, he received a response, not from the HOA office, but from Linda Powell herself. Mr. Carter, our policies are clearly outlined in the HOA handbook you agreed to when moving in. If you do not comply, we will be forced to escalate the matter further. She even had the audacity to sign it off with. Looking forward to your cooperation, Linda Powell, HOA president. Michael felt his blood pressure spike. This wasn't just about a rule anymore. Linda was digging her heels in, and she was clearly underestimating who she was dealing with. Later that afternoon, Ethan came home from school, his white cane tapping against the pavement as he made his way to the front door. Shadow, ever the loyal companion, immediately trotted over to greet him. Ethan reached down, feeling for Shadow's head before ruffling his fur. "Hey, boy," he said with a grin. Michael took a deep breath. His son had no idea the HOA was actively trying to take his service dog away. But then, just as Michael was about to take Ethan inside, 2 uniformed police officers pulled up to the house. Michael felt his stomach drop as he watched them step out of their cruiser. This wasn't happening. Except it was. And the HOA had just made their biggest mistake yet. Michael squared his shoulders as the 2 police officers approached his front porch. One was an older man with a graying mustache, while the other looked fresh out of the academy. Both had their hands resting near their belts, radiating the stiff posture of men expecting trouble. "Mr. Carter?" the older officer asked, glancing down at a notepad. Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's me." "What's this about, officers?" The younger officer exchanged a glance with his partner, then cleared his throat. "We received a complaint from the HOA about an unregistered dog violating neighborhood policy. They claim it's causing disturbances and needs to be removed." Michael felt his jaw tighten. He could already see Linda Powell smirking from her window across the street, peeking through her blinds like she was watching some kind of live TV drama. Ethan, who had been calmly petting Shadow, suddenly tensed. "Wait, they're trying to take Shadow?" he asked, turning his head toward the voices. The older officer hesitated, clearly not expecting a blind teenager to be involved. Sir, the HOA president insists the dog is not properly registered and violates their pet restrictions." Michael let out a slow breath. They were really trying this. "Shadow isn't a pet," Michael said coldly. "He's a federally recognized service dog under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The HOA has zero authority to remove him, and if you so much as try, you'll be violating federal law." The younger cop's posture shifted slightly. He was clearly realizing they might have walked into something bigger than a simple neighborhood dispute. But the older officer was still determined. "Sir, we're just here to assess the situation. If there's a violation of community policy, we have to follow up." Michael crossed his arms. It was time to make things clear. "You have no jurisdiction here," he said evenly. "And neither does the HOA. I suggest you check the ADA guidelines before you take another step." At that moment, Ethan reached down and clutched Shadow's harness tightly, as if he could sense what was happening. His face was pale, his usual confidence wavering. Michael turned back to the officers. "And just so we're clear, I'm a federal judge. If you think I'm going to stand here and let an overreaching HOA violate my son's rights, you're sorely mistaken." The older officer's face went rigid. The younger one visibly paled. Michael let the silence stretch. Then, finally, the senior officer took a small step back. I think we need to have another discussion with the complainant." Michael nodded. "Yeah, you do that." As the officers turned and walked back to their patrol car, Linda Powell stormed out of her house, arms crossed, ready to argue. But before she could say a word, the older officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, we need to talk." Michael smiled to himself. Linda had no idea how badly she had just lost. Linda Powell's smug expression vanished the moment the officers turned on her instead. She had been expecting them to drag Shadow away, maybe even issue a fine on the spot. Instead, she was suddenly the one under scrutiny. "Ma'am," the older officer said, his tone now much firmer. "Are you aware that service animals are protected under federal law?" Linda huffed, crossing her arms. "It's a violation of the HOA's pet policy. No animals over 25 pounds are allowed. It's in the handbook." The younger officer sighed. "That doesn't override the Americans with Disabilities Act. Service dogs are not considered pets under the law." Michael leaned against his porch railing, watching the exchange like a predator watching its prey stumble. Linda had spent months harassing his family, and now she was realizing she was in deep water. "I don't care what some law says," Linda snapped. "This is our community, and we have rules. If we start making exceptions, what's next? People keeping chickens? Goats? This is exactly why we have an HOA." Michael chuckled, shaking his head. "You really think you're above federal law, don't you?" Linda turned back to him, her face red with frustration. "You don't get special treatment just because you're a judge." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Special treatment? My son is blind, Linda. His service dog helps him navigate the world. And you're throwing a tantrum over a pet policy like it somehow trumps federal protections." The younger officer turned back to Linda. "Ma'am, I'd suggest you drop this complaint. If you continue to target the Carters over their service animal, you could be looking at a discrimination lawsuit." That finally shut her up. Linda took a step back, her face twitching with barely contained rage. She opened her mouth, then snapped it shut, realizing she was now dangerously close to legal trouble. But Michael wasn't done. He stepped down from his porch and walked right up to her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You want to play HOA dictator? Go right ahead. But let me remind you of something. You just tried to use law enforcement to violate a disabled child's rights. That's not just unethical, Linda. That's illegal. And since I happen to be a federal judge, I know exactly how to make sure you feel the consequences." Linda's confidence shattered right before his eyes. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She clearly wanted to argue, but there was no way out of this mess. "I was just trying to maintain community standards," she muttered, her voice weak. Michael smirked. "Oh, don't worry. I plan to maintain some standards, too." The officers, now thoroughly done with Linda, turned back to Michael. "Sir, sorry for the inconvenience," the older one said. "We'll be noting in our report that this was a frivolous complaint." Michael nodded. "Appreciate it." As the officers walked back to their car, Linda stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard that it rattled the windows. Ethan stepped forward, grinning for the first time all day. "That was amazing, Dad." Michael patted Shadow's head. "Oh, we're just getting started." Linda thought she could bully a federal judge and get away with it. She was dead wrong. Michael knew that simply humiliating Linda in front of the police wasn't enough. She had been harassing his son, threatening to remove a legally protected service dog, and weaponizing the HOA to violate federal law. So he decided to do what he did best, take legal action. Filing the lawsuit. The very next morning, Michael sat in his home office, meticulously drafting a lawsuit against the HOA. It wasn't just about Linda anymore. This was about holding the entire HOA board accountable for allowing her to abuse her power. Disability discrimination. The HOA tried to remove a service dog under a pet policy that did not apply to service animals under the Americans with Disabilities Act (ADA). Harassment. Linda had repeatedly targeted Ethan, making his life in the neighborhood miserable. Misuse of authority. The HOA had ignored federal law and attempted to use law enforcement to intimidate a disabled child. Michael wasn't just suing for damages, he was seeking to have the HOA leadership investigated and restructured. This wasn't just about winning. This was about making sure it never happened again. The HOA gets served. A week later, Linda and the entire HOA board received formal legal notices. Linda, sitting in her pristine white living room, nearly choked on her morning coffee when she opened the letter. "What?" she screeched, scanning the documents with shaking hands. HOA President Greg Mitchell, a timid middle-aged man who had mostly let Linda run things, turned pale when he read his. The HOA was being sued, not just fined, not just given a warning. So, and the plaintiff? Michael Carter, a sitting federal judge. The HOA board panics. An emergency HOA meeting was called that same night. The board members gathered at the clubhouse, all whispering nervously. "This is bad," one board member muttered. Really bad. Another shook his head. We can't fight a federal judge. Linda slammed her fist on the table. We are not backing down. He's just trying to intimidate us. We need to fight this. Greg rubbed his temples. Linda, you're missing the point. He's right. We broke federal law. Linda scoffed. It's just some stupid dog. He's overreacting. One of the older board members leaned forward. Linda, listen to yourself. You try to have a blind kid's service dog taken away. This isn't just about some fine. This is about a lawsuit that could destroy the HOA. Greg sighed. We need legal counsel. Linda waved her hand dismissively. Then we'll get a lawyer. We'll fight this. Silence. Finally, one board member cleared his throat. With what money? Linda blinked. What? Greg threw a stack of financial documents on the table. We're already running a deficit. If we go to court, we'll drain the HOA's funds. If we lose, which we will, we could be looking at massive fines and legal fees. Linda's face went pale. For the first time, she looked afraid. Michael wasn't just suing them. He was about to tear the apart from the inside, and she was powerless to stop it. Linda had always bullied her way out of trouble. She assumed this time would be no different. But when she saw the full legal complaint Michael had filed, reality hit her like a freight train. This wasn't just a simple lawsuit. It was an airtight legal case that could dismantle the HOA entirely. And if that happened, Linda and every board member could be personally held liable. The HOA's desperate attempt to settle. Greg, the HOA president, wasted no time in calling Michael's office. Judge Carter, we would love to discuss an amicable solution, he said, his voice trembling. Perhaps a settlement to avoid an expensive legal battle? Michael leaned back in his chair, smirking. They were scared. Good. Greg, your board tried to take a disabled child service dog away and involve the police under false pretenses, Michael said calmly. You think a settlement will fix that? Greg gulped. I understand, but surely we can come to some kind of arrangement? Michael remained silent for a moment. Then he spoke. I'll see you in court. And with that, he hung up. The board descends into chaos. When Greg relayed Michael's response to the rest of the HO board, panic spread like wildfire. This is insane, one board member said, flipping through the legal documents. He's not just suing us, he's demanding a full audit of HOA finances and board operations. Linda gritted her teeth. We can fight this. We don't have the money, Linda. Greg snapped. Legal fees alone could bankrupt the HOA. And if we lose, we'll be personally responsible for damages. Silence. For the first time, Linda felt something she hadn't felt in years. Fear. Michael wasn't just fighting back. He was coming for all of them. Michael's secret weapon, the HOA's hidden corruption. What the HOA didn't know. Michael had already started digging deeper into their operations. And what he found? Massive financial discrepancies. Thousands of dollars in misused HOA funds. Questionable fines against homeowners. And most importantly, illegal kickbacks Linda had been receiving from contractors. Michael had evidence that Linda had been profiting from her position for years. And now, he was about to expose her to the entire community. The court date arrived faster than the HOA expected, and by then, their panic had turned into full-blown terror. Michael walked into the courtroom calm and composed, while Greg, Linda, and the rest of the HOA board members looked like they hadn't slept in days. They had no idea what was coming. Michael's devastating opening statement. Michael stood before the judge, his voice steady but filled with authority. Your Honor, this case is not just about an HOA harassing a blind child and his guide dog. This is about a corrupt organization abusing its power, financially exploiting homeowners, and trampling on the law for their own benefit. He turned and looked directly at Linda. And today, we're going to prove just how deep their corruption goes. Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had assumed this trial would be a simple case about the dog, not a full-blown investigation into her dirty dealings. The HOA's crimes are unveiled. Michael's legal team began dropping bombshells one after another. Evidence of forged documents showing how Linda and Greg had been fabricating violations to fine homeowners unfairly. Bank statements proving that HOA funds had been used for luxurious business trips, which were nothing more than vacations for the board members. A whistleblower testimony from a former HOA accountant who revealed that Linda had been taking kickbacks from contractors in exchange for awarding them lucrative neighborhood contracts. Every new revelation tightened the noose around the HOA's neck. And as the evidence piled up, Greg turned pale, and Linda looked like she was about to faint. Linda tries to defend herself and fails miserably. When it was her turn to speak, Linda tried one last desperate attempt to lie her way out. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said, forcing a smile. "I have always acted in the best interest of the community." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Really?" he asked. "Then can you explain why thousands of dollars in HOA fees went directly into your personal bank account?" Linda's face turned bright red. She stammered, "That's not—" Michael cut her off. "We have the records, Linda. And the judge has seen them. There's no way out of this." The judge nodded grimly, turning to Linda and the rest of the HOA board. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, I have no choice but to hold the HOA accountable for financial misconduct, abuse of power, and fraudulent activity." Linda sank in her chair. She knew what was coming next. The HOA is ordered to pay millions in damages. The judge ruled that the HOA was to pay a massive financial settlement to Michael's family for harassment, emotional distress, and abuse of power. Linda and Greg were personally fined for financial fraud and mismanagement. The HOA board was dissolved, and a new leadership committee would be put in place, with homeowners given full transparency over how their funds were used. Michael's son was granted a lifetime exemption from any HOA restrictions regarding his guide dog. Linda collapsed into tears. Her reign of terror was officially over. And Michael, he had won, not just for his son, but for every homeowner who had suffered under their tyranny. With the court's ruling, the entire neighborhood erupted in celebration. For years, homeowners had been afraid to speak up, worried about retaliation from Linda and her corrupt board. But now, justice had been served. The HOA had lost its power, and the people who had suffered under its tyranny were finally free. Linda faces the consequences. Linda, once the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, was now a disgraced outcast. She was forced to resign from the HOA immediately. The hefty fine she owed meant she had to sell her house to cover the damages. She was even banned from serving on any HOA board ever again, thanks to the court's ruling. Her neighbors, who had once feared her, now openly laughed when they saw her packing up to move. As she drove away from the community she once ruled, she realized she had lost everything. Greg tries to escape, but karma catches up. Greg, Linda's right-hand man, wasn't much better off. After the court found him guilty of embezzling HOA funds, he was sentenced to community service and ordered to pay back every cent he had stolen. His employer found out about his shady dealings and fired him on the spot. In an ironic twist, the same HOA fines he used to impose on others came back to haunt him. He was now thousands of dollars in debt and had to take a lower-paying job just to stay afloat. The HOA gets rebuilt the right way. With the old board dismantled, a new HOA leadership team was put in place. This time, it was made up of honest homeowners who actually cared about the community. All unfair fines from Linda's reign were refunded to the people. Homeowners were given a transparent system to vote on neighborhood rules. The HOA's new leadership ensured no more abuse of power would ever happen again. The difference was night and day. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was peaceful, fair, and truly a community. Michael's son gets the last laugh. As for Michael's son, he was finally free to live his life without fear of harassment. His guide dog remained by his side, and the entire community now respected and supported him. One afternoon, as he walked through the neighborhood with his dog, he overheard an old HOA member whispering, "If only we had known who his dad was." He smiled. Now they knew, and they never forget it. The neighborhood, now thriving under fair leadership, came together for the first time in years to celebrate the victory. The newly appointed HOA board organized a community event, bringing everyone together for a barbecue in the park. People shared their stories of the old days, how Linda and her cronies had made life so difficult, and how now they could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Michael and his son attended, and for the first time, they were treated like heroes in the community rather than outcasts. The event was full of joy and laughter as neighbors who hadn't spoken to each other in years reconnected, shared laughs, and remembered the strength they'd shown in the face of oppression. Michael's speech. At one point, Michael was asked to speak. Standing in front of the gathered crowd, he said, I want to thank everyone who stood up with us. Together, we've proven that when we fight for what's right, we can accomplish anything. This victory isn't just about me or my son. It's about all of us standing up against abuse of power. The crowd erupted in applause. It was an emotional moment for everyone, realizing they had come through a dark time and were now living in a much brighter, more just environment. A new beginning. As the event went on, people started to talk about the future. The new HOA promised to keep things fair by always being transparent and making sure all homeowners were heard. The idea of community and respect began to take center stage, with everyone eager to make this a place they could be proud of. Michael looked around and thought about how far they had come. He had fought for justice and won. His son, who had once been marginalized and mistreated, was now surrounded by people who care about him and understood his struggles. This wasn't just a win for Michael, it was a win for everyone who had been pushed around by people like Linda. Karma catches up with the rest of the HOA board. While Linda and Greg were the most prominent figures to fall, the rest of the corrupt HOA board members weren't exempt from the consequences of their actions. Investigations into their roles reveal that more shady practices have been taking place, including mismanagement of HOA funds and exploitation of homeowners. As a result, several other board members were removed, and some even faced legal repercussions for their roles in enabling Linda's reign of terror. Many were forced to resign and were replaced by honest, reliable individuals who put the needs of the community first. The HOA, now under new management, became a beacon of integrity and accountability, two qualities that were sorely lacking during Linda's rule. A renewed sense of unity. The entire neighborhood felt like a community again. People trusted each other, and it wasn't just about fixing the HOA system, it was about creating a sense of belonging. Michael's son, who had once faced such adversity, now participated in neighborhood events, and his guide dog was seen as a symbol of resilience by everyone. The community learned that no matter how difficult the past was, it could always be changed for the better. And the lesson was clear: unity and justice would always win. As the community continued to rebuild, Michael's experience became a powerful lesson for the next generation. His story wasn't just one of personal victory, it was a reminder that standing up for what's right could change the course of history. Local schools began incorporating lessons on justice, fairness, and community activism into their curricula. The children in the neighborhood were taught about Michael's struggle and how he had fought for the rights of all citizens, not just himself. It wasn't long before young residents were inspired to get involved in their community, always remembering the importance of justice and speaking out against injustice when it occurs. In this new generation, there was a renewed sense of responsibility, where everyone felt like they had a voice and that their actions could shape the future for the better. A new standard for leadership. Michael's rise to the top wasn't just about defeating the old HOA. It was about redefining leadership in the neighborhood. The new HOA president and board members upheld a high standard of conduct. They prioritized transparency, regular town hall meetings where residents could voice their concerns and be heard. Integrity, fair rules that didn't favor a select few, but worked for the community as a whole. Respect, ensuring that every homeowner, regardless of their background or situation, felt valued and treated with dignity. The story of Michael, his son, and the entire community's fight was shared at neighborhood events, and each retelling reinforced the values that were now the backbone of the community. Michael's role in shaping the future. As time passed, Michael became more than just a hero. He became a symbol of accountability and resilience. He took on a more prominent role in his community, working alongside other leaders to ensure that nothing like the old HOA regime ever happened again. He worked to establish a community foundation focused on supporting disabled individuals and creating accessible environments for people with disabilities. He also helped to train future HOA board members, teaching them the principles of fairness and community, ensuring that his story would live on through the actions of future leaders. Michael had done more than just fight a battle. He had helped to create a system that would serve as a model for future communities. His fight had ensured that his neighborhood would be a place where justice, fairness, and compassion were at the forefront. The end of an era, the HOA's downfall. With all the reforms in place, the era of the tyrannical HOA was finally over. Linda and her cronies were no longer a threat. The community thrived without the shadow of corruption looming over them. The HOA board, now a diverse group of honest individuals, worked together to ensure that the problems of the past wouldn't repeat themselves. The new leadership made sure that the members of the community were not only heard but valued, and that decisions were made with their best interests in mind. The impact of Michael's fight was felt far and wide, and his story of perseverance and justice became an example for everyone who was willing to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. As years passed, Michael's legacy continued to shape the community. The reforms and changes he fought for had laid a strong foundation for the neighborhood, but his influence extended beyond just his local area. His story became a beacon of hope and justice for many in the wider region. His legal expertise and personal resolve were sought after by other communities facing similar HOA struggles. Michael started giving talks at local events and was invited to speak at conferences where he shared his journey. He worked on writing a book about his experiences, sharing the lessons he had learned about standing up for oneself, fighting for justice, and the importance of community solidarity. This book became a guide for people who felt powerless or oppressed by local governing bodies. Michael's journey was one of personal growth and public service, showing that even one individual could make a profound difference. His commitment to justice and fairness was a testament to the idea that ordinary people can fight injustice and win. Community trust rebuilds. The sense of trust in the community that had been broken by the previous HOA board was finally restored. With a new leadership, the residents felt like they had regained control over their own lives. The board worked to ensure that the community's rules and regulations were now about benefiting everyone, rather than serving the interests of a few. There was an open-door policy where people could raise issues or concerns without fear of retribution. This transparency led to a stronger sense of unity among the residents. The board also initiated several community improvement projects, including creating more green spaces, developing accessible pathways for disabled residents, and providing financial assistance to those in need. Thanks to Michael's leadership and his relentless fight for fairness, the community had not only survived but had thrived. People were proud of where they lived and felt a renewed sense of empowerment, knowing that their voices mattered and that their rights were being respected. The end of the old regime, HOA's final collapse. The old HOA leadership, now fully removed from the community, faced legal consequences for their actions. The corrupt officials were charged for their involvement in the exploitation of residents, and some were even criminally prosecuted. As more details emerge about the corruption and illegal activities of the past board, it became clear that the community had been under the thumb of tyranny for years. The former members of the HOA board, including Linda, lost any hope of returning to power. Their reputation was forever tarnished, and their businesses and personal lives suffered due to the fallout from the scandal. The community, once at the mercy of the HOA, was now free to live without fear. They had a system in place that served them, not the other way around. And Michael was a hero in this newfound era of freedom. As Michael's efforts in dismantling the corrupt HOA and rebuilding the community took shape, he began to gain the recognition he deserved, not just locally, but from a wider audience. People from other cities who had experienced similar issues with HOA organizations reached out to him for advice, guidance, and support. His story became one of empowerment, showing how one person could create real change against a powerful institution. He was awarded several local and state honors, recognizing his courage and tenacity in standing up to what was an overwhelming and systemic abuse of power. His efforts in community organization were recognized as groundbreaking, providing a blueprint for others facing similar oppression. A local charity in his name was established to help individuals who had been victims of corrupt systems, whether they were HOA-related or otherwise. This foundation began funding legal defense for individuals in similar situations, helping them fight back against unfair practices. Michael's name was now synonymous with justice in the community. He became a symbol of resilience and hope, proving that the fight for what's right could be won, even against the toughest of odds. Despite his newfound fame and the profound changes he had set in motion, Michael remained grounded. His relationship with his family flourished as they continued to support him throughout his journey. He often reflected on how the experience of taking on the HOA had not only changed the community, but also transformed him as an individual. His bond with his children grew even stronger as they saw their father's selflessness and courage. Michael made it a priority to teach them important lessons about integrity, justice, and the importance of always standing up for what's right, even when it seems impossible. His wife, who had stood by his side throughout the long legal battles, became a powerful advocate herself. She began speaking publicly about the need for reform in local communities and the importance of protecting human rights. The entire family grew closer through the experience, and together they continued to be an example of strength and unity. As the case against the corrupt HOA board concluded with a victory, Michael realized that this was only the beginning. His legacy of change would continue to echo through the community for years to come. Not only had he won against the corrupt system, but he had also set an example for future generations on how to stand up for justice in their own lives. The new HOA board, one that represented the people, worked to build a better future, creating more inclusive and equitable living spaces for everyone. They focused on education, helping people understand their rights, and how to actively participate in the governance of their communities. Michael's efforts were an inspiration to many, and his story was used as an example of how the fight for justice could lead to lasting change. In the end, the community became a shining example of how the power of one person could topple an unjust system and create a foundation for a future built on fairness, honesty, and integrity. Michael's work not only ended the reign of the corrupt HOA board, but also became a beacon of hope for people everywhere who believed in the importance of standing up for what's right. Michael had proven that even in a world filled with corruption, there's always hope for change, and that one voice could make a world of difference.